Cheaters are very cunning people, but sooner or later, each one of them will get caught. As absurd as it might sound, every cheater wants to be caught. This is because cheaters start to feel invincible and make a lot of mistakes, which leads to their downfall. That's how it happened with my unfaithful wife. I learned a tough lesson about how quickly an ordinary person's daily life can fall apart. A few years ago, my family, my wife and 38 years old, myself, Larry Dragon, 42 years old, and our children, Angelica, 8, and Egit, 6, weren't the happiest group in our Scandinavian county capital, but we held it together for the sake of the kids. Things took a turn when I ran into an old schoolmate, Tom Hall, on a Friday after work at the liquor store. It had been years since we'd last seen each other, and with the store being busy, we had just enough time to catch up. To our surprise, we discovered that Tom's wife, Cecilia, worked in the same office where and had been for the last few months. Tom asked, "Didn't I see you at our wife's Christmas party? Are you coming to the farewell event for the company's former owners?" I told him I'd love to go, but I hadn't received an invitation. Tom looked surprised and replied, "Of course you're invited. All couples are welcome. Why wouldn't you be? I'll double-check with Ann, but you can be sure we'll see you there, old friend." The big company event was just 2.5 months after the Christmas party, as the previous owners had sold their shares to a national investment firm and wanted to thank all their colleagues before transitioning to new ownership on March 1st. The Christmas party had already been on my mind since it marked Anne's debut at her new job, and she had even mentioned feeling sorry that I wasn't invited. She had also splurged on a new, seductive dress for the occasion, looking stunning. However, she came home at 4 a.m., clearly intoxicated and disheveled. Despite some heated arguments, I chose to believe her story about the party and the drink afterward at a friend's house, where she insisted that nothing improper had happened with any other man. Though I had my doubts, I didn't waste time confronting and after returning from errands. I ran into my old friend Tom Hall at the liquor store. "He mentioned his wife works at your company," I said. Anne's expression grew nervous. "What's her name?" "Cecilia?" "No, I don't know her," she replied. "He said he knows you," I continued. "And he also mentioned that all couples were invited to your Christmas party. So, who pretended to be your partner, and where did you spend the night?" Her face paled as she stammered, "I've told you countless times, I genuinely thought couples weren't invited. I was new and misunderstood the invitation." "So, you were the only one naive enough not to understand a simple invite at your own company? I'm going to find out who took advantage of you after the party, and they'll regret crossing my path." Tears ran down her face as she pleaded, "I've explained this to you countless times. It was just a group of colleagues, maybe a dozen of us, at someone's house. A few drinks, a little dancing, nothing that should make you so angry and suspicious." Her story had too many inconsistencies, but without evidence, I couldn't press further. So I asked, "Am I invited and reserved for the next company party?" Once again, I noticed a strange look on her face, as she hadn't mentioned the upcoming event before. Knowing that I now knew couples were invited, she replied, "Of course, I've reserved us both, but I forgot to mention it." Doubts about Anne's honesty crept into our marriage, and any thoughts of intimacy with her felt pointless. The situation worsened the following Friday afternoon when I took a few hours off to run errands with Anne, who usually finishes work at 1. We were both home when the phone rang. Upon answering, I heard car radio music before the caller abruptly hung up and asked, "Who was it?" I responded, "Your lover," but they hung up when they realized I answered. My response was intended as a harmless joke, but I couldn't help but notice how she hesitated for a moment before snapping, "You're so strange. What on earth do you think of me?" "It was just an innocent joke," I said. "But now, after your extreme reaction, I'm not sure if I went too far." Eventually, she calmed down and spoke quietly. "No, you were right. It felt more like one of your jealous moments than a silly joke, but I apologize for losing my temper. I had a terrible day at work, and while that's no excuse, I hope it sheds some light on why I reacted poorly." at the next party and chose a less provocative outfit compared to the last time, and her mood seemed far from cheerful as we arrived. The event was held at one of the city's finest hotels, with dinner served at round tables instead of the usual long ones. Sitting with 5 other couples, it was clear that Anne knew all the other women. I couldn't shake the feeling that she viewed my presence as a nuisance, interrupting her plans for an enjoyable evening. After dinner, while we enjoyed coffee and cognac, her boss, Dean, approached our table for a brief conversation. Noticing that I was seated next to Anne, he commented, "You must be Anne's husband. Sorry you couldn't make it to the Christmas party." I replied, "I wasn't actually invited to that party, at least that's what Anne told me." Looking at Anne, her boss asked, "But all couples were invited. How did you miss that?" I added, "She came home very late and in a sorry state, so I assumed she preferred someone from the office to accompany her instead of me." Some of the other couples couldn't suppress their laughter and turned red as a tomato, clearly uncomfortable. Her boss said, "I'm not aware of that," before excusing himself. I added, "Maybe you should investigate. There are always loose ends in every workplace." And began to cry, and I'm sure the other couples found the situation uncomfortable as they all made excuses and headed for the bathroom. I also went to the bathroom, where I had a brief conversation with one of the other spouses sitting at our table. He mentioned that he and his wife had been seated near and at the Christmas party, and throughout the evening, she had been quite close to one of her colleagues. He remembered Anne because of her distinguished and old-fashioned last name. I never anticipated that something like this would happen to me, but I know that many naive men before me have discovered the painful truth about their unfaithful wives through some unexpected circumstance. It hit me like a punch in the gut. I admit that I had noticed the spark between Anne and me had dimmed lately, but I attributed it to the natural ebbs and flows that occur in all marriages. I didn't worry too much, trusting that things would improve soon. However, I didn't see Anne at the party, and a colleague informed me that she had left and wasn't answering her phone. When the babysitter didn't answer our home phone either, I realized Anne must have come home and dismissed her. I stayed at the bar, relieved that no one mentioned Anne. Upon returning home, I found her asleep in our bed. The next day marked the worst day of our 11-year marriage. Anne yelled and refused to reveal where she had been or with whom at the Christmas party. By Monday morning, she resumed her work as usual, relieved that none of her colleagues mentioned my embarrassing behavior at the dinner, not even her boss, who evidently considered it a personal matter. However, gossip among her coworkers behind her back was another story. The following Friday night brought an unexpected surprise when Anne became intimate with me, a marked contrast to her usual behavior. Naturally, I couldn't help but suspect that her newfound interest in our intimacy had something to do with my recent comments about an old lover, and fell asleep shortly after our tense encounter. The next 8 days passed without incident, giving me hope that our relationship was improving. However, one morning my optimism collapsed when I noticed Anne was dressed more elegantly than usual, her hair impeccably styled. During breakfast, she casually mentioned the possibility of needing to work overtime, a detail she conveniently forgot to mention the previous day. I saw no reason to hold back my thoughts, so I abruptly said, "Do you dress provocatively for overtime? Wouldn't it be better to be honest and admit you're planning to see your lover?" Her surprise was evident before she exploded, "You're crazy again. You really need help with your paranoia. I think it's best to end this marriage so you can be with your lover openly. I won't stay married to a cheater, that's for sure." And began to cry, and our kids joined in. I started to regret my actions, wondering how they had affected my family. I had provoked a serious argument based solely on suspicions without any evidence of Anne's infidelity, just a nagging feeling from a sleepless night. After crying for a while, Anne tearfully asked, "Do you really want a divorce?" I replied, "Yes, if you're determined to ruin our marriage, we should both move on. I'm tired of being treated poorly. Believe me, I've had enough." And rushed back to our bedroom, and I felt a pang of regret for accusing her of infidelity without a shred of evidence. I realized I had acted primitively, handling the situation entirely the wrong way. I should have taken the conventional route of gathering evidence before making accusations. When Anne returned to the kitchen a few minutes later, she was dressed for a regular day. Neither of us spoke, unsure of what to say. I realized that only a miracle could save our marriage. If Anne was innocent, she might not be able to endure the humiliation I had caused her. If she was guilty, our marriage would probably end as soon as I found proof. That evening, Anne shared a story about telling her boss that I had denied her overtime, and he believed her due to our previous discussions about the party. I should have contacted her boss, but I didn't. To my relief, unexpected help came from the new owners of her company. Their IT specialists conducted a covert investigation into the office's computer usage and found that, on average, employees spent 52 minutes per day on personal matters. The most egregious case involved someone who had been online for 16 hours during the week under scrutiny. The following Monday morning, all the staff at Anne's office were called to a meeting where they were informed of new regulations. These rules prohibited any personal internet use, and the restructuring led to the firing of the four most recent hires. Anne kept her job, but now had to use the shared computer at home for all her email correspondence. Although the kids had computers, they were not given internet access. I've always had an interest in computer programs, and I felt the game was now in my favor. I was prepared, having set up the computer with a mirror program to save copies of everything she did. Another program would recover anything she deleted. Within days, Anne created a new email account on our computer in addition to her existing Hotmail address, which she used for innocent chats with old friends who had moved away. The new account received only a few messages, mostly from someone named Happy Lad, along with the usual spam. During the first week, Anne's messages were innocent, informing Happy Lad of her new email address and that she was available online again. Even if she deleted them, her initial response was simply, "Great to have my dear online again." Now, I was certain that Anne was involved in something, and I had high hopes of collecting valuable information. They were probably using cell phones as their primary means of communication, especially since Anne's access to our home computer was limited, and she knew about my expertise with computers. However, I suspected she preferred email for longer messages. I made the firm decision that if Anne's infidelity led to our divorce, she wouldn't get 50% of our assets. I had worked diligently to build a stable financial foundation for my family, and I was determined that no scoundrel would benefit from it. Consequently, I methodically implemented the plan I had devised to safeguard my finances. Being the sole owner of our home, I secured a substantial loan under the pretense of investments without Anne's signature. To my surprise, the bank approved my request without hesitation. The next day, I informed Anne that I needed to travel to Italy for final negotiations on purchasing a new machine for work. She expressed no objections or questions, as similar trips had been part of my routine before. The next day, I visited a local travel agency and purchased an expensive flight to Malaga, Spain. I also had them book a hotel room in Gibraltar, a small British territory notorious for its role in money laundering within Europe. I made sure to reserve tickets for my trip from Gibraltar to London and back home. As expected, and didn't contact my workplace to inquire about my 3-day absence. Upon departing for my trip, I boarded a local bus from Malaga to the Spanish border town of La Linea and then headed to Gibraltar. However, I didn't engage in any illicit activities. Instead, I spent my time visiting the famous rock and its surroundings. The next morning, I took the earliest flight to London and then returned home. Throughout the trip, I mostly used my personal credit card, a choice that would make tracking easier if necessary in the future. For now, my only recourse was to monitor her activities on our computer. Unfortunately, there wasn't much of value at first. I had only found one message from Happy Lad expressing his loneliness in a hotel room and wishing for Anne's presence to comfort him. She hadn't responded by email, which led me to check her cell phone while she was in the shower. However, as usual, all messages had been deleted. Finally, I succeeded in intercepting her next email, which contained valuable details. "Hi, dear. Sorry for my absence, I've been busy with important clients up north, far away from you. While your partner was in Italy, I missed our meetings terribly, knowing you were waiting for me every night. But there's good news. Next Wednesday, I've cleared my schedule and have the whole day free in the city. The only thing I have to do is go to the dentist from 9:30 to 10:30. We'll have the rest of the day just for us, you and me. And please take at least that day off from 11 a.m. onward and spend it with me. Yours, Frederick. Now that I knew his name and profession, I held on to a faint hope that she would use this letter to respond, and indeed, she did. Dear Frederick, I will gladly take the afternoon off. How about a romantic dinner at your place to avoid being seen in public? I still feel Larry's suspicions, so this exceptional meeting seems like a reasonable way to keep our secret. However, I agree that this moment will benefit us both. I've often thought of you and look forward to our special day together. With love, Anne. With great satisfaction, I rented an apartment and paid a year's rent in advance, anticipating potential complications with the authorities during my divorce. Locating a seller named Frederick in our city turned out to be a challenge, as both the name and profession were too common. I suspected he might be affiliated with the same company as Anne, but without more clues regarding the date and time, I had little chance of tracking him down. In today's world, many people heavily rely on cell phones for communication, and evidently, Anne and her lover Frederick were no exception since I found no further information on our computer. The day before Anne's anticipated event, I finalized my preparations, draining both my personal bank accounts and our joint account, funneling the money through covert channels. I also arranged for a van with heavily tinted windows. To my surprise, Anne behaved completely normally on her big Wednesday morning. There was no seductive outfit, no special hairstyle, nothing to suggest she was anticipating a meeting with her lover. I began to hope she had canceled the whole thing. However, despite my efforts to hide my anxiety, Anne noticed my worried expression and asked, "Are you okay? You don't look well. What could be wrong?" I replied, "I'm fine, just a little worried about some minor issues I need to resolve today, but everything's under control." "I was worried because you looked so pale." "Don't worry, I'm fine," she said. "By the way, it would be great to have lunch together today so we can discuss some important matters." Once again, she looked uneasy as she responded, "I'd love to, but I'm sorry, I can't. I already have an important work meeting scheduled for lunch. Tomorrow works better for me." I looked at her directly and said, "I understand. Priorities first." Once again, she seemed to lose color from her face. I hoped she had reconsidered any undesirable plans she had for the day, but I wasn't fine at all. The fate of our family hinged on what she intended to do in the next few hours. I feared this might be our last family breakfast and that our plans for lunch would be indefinitely canceled. And left for work, taking our youngest to preschool, while Angelica went to school, leaving me alone at home once again. After taking the day off work, by 10:30, I had strategically parked outside Anne's workplace, positioned to keep an eye on both her car and the employee entrance. Thanks to the tinted windows, I remained invisible as I waited in the back seat behind the driver's seat. At 5:11, she exited the parking lot and drove to a residential area just outside the city center. She parked outside one of the entrances and went inside. I waited 5 minutes before calling her cell phone. When she saw my name on the caller ID, she answered, "What's up, Larry?" I said, "You, my dear, are my biggest problem. Your lover is at home, and you're supposed to be there with him. I'm on my way to confront him. Get dressed and leave his apartment before I arrive." She sounded worried but replied, "What are you talking about?" "I'm at work, of course." I responded, "If what you say is true, that's in your favor. If not, this won't end well." I hung up the phone and found myself standing in front of Frederick's door, holding a demolition hammer hidden in a black trash bag. As expected, a man in his 50s appeared a minute later. Without hesitation, I swung my right fist, catching him off guard and forcing him back into the apartment. And was behind him, pale and trembling. I shouted, "Get out of here right now." Before she could react, I pushed her out and locked the door behind her. Once alone with Frederick, I unleashed a series of blows until he collapsed on the floor. Under different circumstances, I'm sure a younger, fitter man would have overpowered me, but taken by surprise and fueled by my rage over my failed marriage, I prevailed. He lay motionless on the floor as I wielded my demolition hammer, smashing every valuable item in his modestly furnished one-bedroom apartment. I realized this place wasn't his actual residence, so I took Frederick's cell phone and certain documents containing his address and personal details outside, and kept ringing the doorbell and shouting, "Don't hurt him, please don't hurt him." I opened the door and dragged her back into the apartment. "It's yours now, you unfaithful woman. Do whatever you want with him, I don't care about either of you." And recoiled in horror at the sight of Frederick and the wrecked apartment, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded, "Please, Larry, let me explain. Please listen." I silenced her with a sharp, "Shut up," and walked out to the van. As I reviewed Frederick's documents, I discovered that he worked as a salesman for the same company as Ann but lived with his family near the national capital. That explained his modest accommodations in our city. Frederick had destroyed my marriage, so as the Bible says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I had only one course of action left. First, I called Ann's parents, informing them that I had to work late and was dealing with personal matters, requesting they look after our kids after school. They agreed. Then, I turned off my phone and set off on a 2-day leisure trip in a rented van. Unfortunately, I can't reveal the details of that trip in this narrative, as I'm aware that this forum has a significant audience in Scandinavia, and innocence could face consequences if I disclosed anything. Upon returning to my hometown 2 days later, I turned my phone on to find numerous messages from Ann. My only response was a text informing her that I had started divorce proceedings and that it was my final decision regarding our marriage. I spent the rest of the day moving my belongings from our house to my new apartment, leaving copies of the divorce papers on the kitchen table. It was evident that Ann's affair with Frederick had been ongoing for several months. If it had been a one-time drunken mistake after the Christmas party, perhaps there would have been a small chance of forgiveness. Alternatively, if what I had revealed during our last family breakfast had caused her to cancel her plans with him, Frederick might have avoided the severe beating he received the next day. The following day, I went to work as usual and was somewhat surprised that Ann hadn't contacted me. The only call I received about Frederick was from the police, who wanted to speak with me. Since both they and I were busy, we scheduled a meeting 3 weeks later. After lunch, I called Ann's mother, who informed me that the kids were staying with her for a few days and had mentioned she had no objections to the divorce. 3 days later, Ann called me, furious because our finances had collapsed. She blamed me for ruining Frederick's home and threatened to sue me. I explained that the lost money could be recovered, but the loss of our love and the destruction of our family were irreparable, and was not satisfied with my response. 3 weeks later, accompanied by my lawyer, I visited the police station. It turned out to be a cordial exchange, and my lawyer raised no objections during the discussion. The police accused me of severely injuring Frederick, rendering him unable to work for 2 weeks, and of causing damage to both his apartment and his home. I refuted all the allegations except for defending myself when confronted by my wife's desperate and enraged lover during the interruption of their meeting. It seemed the police were doing their duty without going out of their way to incriminate me. Clearly, they had no sympathy for a disloyal wife and her parasitic partner. I wasn't too worried, since even if I were found guilty and ordered to compensate Frederick, it wouldn't provide him with any benefit. The verdict would simply grant him a legal avenue to collect from me, but if I lacked the means to pay, that would become his problem, something the legal system wouldn't address. To my surprise, Ann called me and proposed a meeting about our children at a restaurant. I accepted the invitation, and we managed to have the meeting civilly. During our conversation, Ann shocked me by admitting her affair with Frederick, which had begun shortly after she started her new job, and explained that during a restructuring in the sales department, she had been working as Frederick's secretary, which led to growing tension between them. Lunch at his apartment turned into a more intimate encounter. Despite their occasional meetings, opportunities were limited since Frederick made infrequent visits to the main office. When Frederick's wife couldn't attend the Christmas party, they seized the opportunity to spend almost the entire night together. and expressed regret, calling her involvement the biggest mistake of her life, and assured me that despite the affair, her family and I had always been her priority. She claimed her love for me remained unchanged, even during my accusations of infidelity. She said they had planned to end the affair the day I confronted Frederick, and that she had imagined rewarding me by becoming a faithful wife again. With Frederick's wife leaving him, they had planned to live together, but had offered to end the relationship if I gave her another chance. Unfortunately, I replied that the pain was too great. We then agreed that she would have primary custody, but the children could visit me as often as they wanted. After some hesitation, she asked about the finances, and I noticed tears in her eyes when I admitted that I had lost everything in reckless investments, explaining that this was the cost of our divorce. To me, losing my family was far more significant than any amount of money. Once again, she promised to reunite the family if I accepted her apology and took her back. Her expression soured when I expressed my preference for having an ex-wife over an unfaithful wife. Before we parted ways, I warned her that hiring a lawyer to recover the lost money would be costly and futile. The following Monday morning at work, when my lovely secretary, Sarah, arrived, I immediately sensed that something was very wrong. She was wearing sunglasses, and when she took them off, I noticed a bruise around her left eye. Her right eye also appeared red, as if she had been crying all weekend. Initially reluctant to talk, Sarah eventually revealed, "I'm now a single mother." Surprised, I asked, "What happened?" She explained, "Daniel and I are over. I was hit for the second time, so I'm filing for divorce. A man who hits his wife twice will probably continue unless she leaves." I had always seen Sarah and Daniel as the epitome of a perfect couple. So I asked, what led to this? What pushed him to such drastic behavior? Sarah explained that jealousy was the cause. The first time he hit me was after I danced a passionate tango with a charming South American man at a wedding. Though it was an innocent dance, Daniel was so furious that he hit me. I forgave him at first, but I warned him that the next time would be the last, and he assured me it wouldn't happen again. But here we are. Astonished, I asked, "And why did he hit you this time?" She responded, "Because he blames me for the breakup between and you." I couldn't understand. How could it be your fault that and slept with that bastard Frederick? That's beyond me. Sarah explained, "Because he believes that you and I had an affair." I was so surprised that I exclaimed, "You and I had an affair? What are you talking about? I didn't even inform you about that. How could I be part of something like that and not know it?" She replied, "Neither you nor I knew about this so-called affair, but apparently we should have been the first to find out." Daniel heard rumors and believed them blindly, without confronting either of us to find out the truth. Instead, he hit me with his fist. I still couldn't believe that someone as decent as Daniel had become so irrational, pushing his beloved wife toward divorce. I had always admired Sarah, but I never made inappropriate comments or advances toward her, even though I preferred her over and if I had to choose. I asked, "Why didn't he come to me directly?" I've stayed faithful to and despite numerous temptations over the years. Sure, I envy David for being married to the woman of my dreams, but mere envy doesn't translate into dishonesty. Where did he get those baseless rumors, and why did he believe them blindly without seeking the truth? Sarah explained that some of David's acquaintances had heard the rumors and passed them on to him. How could he be so foolish as to confront us with fists instead of talking to us? She tried to laugh, then commented, "Now that your dream girl is single, your place or mine?" I returned her a reassuring smile and replied, "I have no intention of holding back, especially now that what you've offered today is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Although we joked about embracing our newly discovered single lives, we both understood that this was a pivotal day that could change our paths in many ways. The tension gradually built, leading her to take the afternoon off work. After work, I returned to my apartment, but I wasn't expecting her arrival. However, at 6 p.m., she appeared at my door with a small travel bag in hand. Sarah commented, "Just in case you're serious about our date." I suggested she rest while I prepared dinner. As we sat on the couch after the meal, talking about our failed marriages, I reassured her every time she asked about the possibility of reconciling with him, firmly stating that such a possibility was off the table. Surprisingly, she slept soundly and woke up feeling slightly better in the morning. The following weekend, we rented a minibus and, on Saturday, went to the nearest zoo with her 2 children and mine. To our delight, everything went even better than expected, which was an encouraging sign that we could function as a single family. On Sunday night, after dropping Sarah's kids off at her parents' and leaving mine with Ann, we enjoyed a romantic dinner at one of the city's finest restaurants. Back at my apartment, we kissed passionately as soon as we closed the door, quickly collapsing onto the bed and diving into intimacy, an obviously new and pleasurable experience for her. She made no move to stop us, and we continued until the end, both left satisfied, especially me, as Sarah exceeded and in satisfaction. Despite numerous attempts by Ann's lawyer to use my trip to Gibraltar against me during the divorce proceedings, I persisted in telling the truth, which ultimately didn't work in my favor. Though Ann's lawyer, Dean, spent much time investigating my financial affairs, the outcome of the divorce was as expected. Ann didn't receive 50% of the property's value and was left with a significant debt to her lawyer. During a conversation with Ann about our children, I warned her about predatory lawyers, which led her to accuse me tearfully, "How could you take all our money? How could you do this to me?" I asked, "How could you betray me? How could you betray my trust?" Her response surprised me. I was a fool. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I asked if Frederick realized the depth of her regret over their affair. She replied, "He also recognizes his part in this disaster and has paid dearly for our indiscretion. But now, you're with the man you love. You should be happy," I said. "Remember, I gave you a fair option during our last family breakfast, and you chose Frederick over staying with me. That decision haunts me." I responded, "Yes, I'm content with Sarah." Although our divorce wasn't what either of us wanted, we both desired for our children to grow up in a home with both parents. We're grateful for each other and committed to making it work. And Frederick bought my old house at a premium price, assuming all the loans, resulting in much higher monthly payments than Ann and I had during our time there. Sarah's husband bought her share of their house at a fair price, and she used that money to invest in a new home where we now live. Sarah and I have moved on. The police didn't pursue further investigations regarding the damage to Frederick's house near the Capitol, as it seemed to be a minor issue for them, especially given staffing shortages and the challenges of cooperation at the time. There were rumors that the house belonged solely to Frederick's wife, who likely received the bulk of the insurance payout. Despite being sentenced to 2 months in a white-collar prison and ordered to compensate Frederick for the assault and damages to his apartment in our city, I never fulfilled this obligation and have no intention of doing so. I've made empty promises to pay once I have the means, but until then, the authorities can't enforce any collection. Sarah and I left our previous jobs, and now Sarah runs her own consulting business, where I work part-time. I've been provided with a company car and live in her house as a tenant, a mutually beneficial arrangement. And continues her pursuit of recovering the money I lost. During a conversation in a pub, while drunk, she pressured Sarah for information, but Sarah honestly admitted her ignorance and indifference, saying that I was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Sarah and I continue working well together, fostering a strong family dynamic filled with laughter, joy, and fulfilling intimacy. My children have grown fond of Sarah, and her kids feel the same about me. Everything was going well until I heard rumors circulating around town about David boasting that he had won Sarah back. Although I knew about his weekly sessions with an expensive therapist, where he bragged about overcoming his past problems, I chose not to mention it to Sarah, preferring to let her make her own decisions. Sarah's ex-in-laws couldn't accept her breakup with their son and made numerous attempts to reunite her with David, offering tempting incentives like a new car or a luxurious vacation in South Africa if she took him back. One night, Sarah expressed concern about attending David's younger sister's wedding, confessing, "I want to go, but if you mind, I'll stay home." I replied, "You're an adult, and if you want to go, you should." It would be interesting to witness their special event, as I feel there may be trouble in their relationship, and this wedding could be their last attempt to save it. Sarah left early Saturday morning, planning to return sometime on Sunday. I refrained from asking for details, leaving it to her discretion. We agreed to limit our phone communication to a single call, during which she confirmed her safe arrival, and I wished her an enjoyable time at the wedding. Despite assuring Sarah of her independence, I couldn't shake my worries. Saturday held significant importance for me, though I hid my apprehension from Sarah. I dreamt of what might happen during her trip, knowing she would face considerable pressure from David, his family, and friends. To my surprise, Sarah returned home at 10 a.m. on Sunday, warmly embracing me. She led me to the bedroom, where our affection quickly intensified. After an intense moment, she whispered, "I adore you." Then she asked, "Did I surprise you with my mood when I came back?" I replied, "You certainly surprised me in a good way. I appreciate that you trusted me enough to attend the wedding, even though reconciling with David would have required serious efforts and temptations." She mentioned that several relatives had stayed the night at David's parents' house after the party, and the plan was for her and David to share a small room with only one bed. Sarah received this insider information from the bride, but she had anticipated something like this and had already booked a hotel room. She left the party when the suggestions about reconciling with David became too frequent to be amusing and checked out of the hotel after an early breakfast. One thing was clear: Sarah and I had a solid bond. Last week, during a meeting with and at a cafe to discuss our children's plans for the coming months, I sensed she seemed unhappier than usual. When I asked if there were problems between her and Frederick, she admitted, "Yes, there are. And I wouldn't hesitate for a second to say yes if you asked me to come back to you." I wasn't surprised, as the kids had shared some stories about disagreements between and Frederick. I confronted her. "He cheated on his wife, and I'm sure you weren't his only affair during that time. Is he still cheating on you?" She broke down in tears and confessed, "Yes, I believe he is." Story 2. My wife, 40, female, and I, 45, male, were extremely excited to send the kids to summer camp for a month. We hadn't had a long time to ourselves in over a year, and she was always a little worried about having sex at night because she didn't want them to hear anything. Once they were gone, we had one extremely romantic night where we had loud sex in random places. It was wonderful, but the next day, we were content. Having any more loud, randomly placed sex seemed unnecessary, and my wife started to get depressed and talk about the kids coming home. I asked her where she'd want to go if she could go anywhere, and she said Georgia. It was where she grew up and where her parents lived in a nursing home. I absolutely hated Georgia. I only lived there for a few years, but it was a terrible town where I feared getting caught in the crossfire of a drug deal gone south. I never got shot, but I was dragged into neighborhood drama and victim to several robberies. If I were to go anywhere, I'd want to go to Kentucky to stay with my uncle. He was like a father figure to me, and for much of my adult life, our relationship was long distance. He was getting older, and I wanted one more visit where I got to help him work on his old cars. Our vacation discussion only made the atmosphere in the house worse. It felt like we were growing apart, but I didn't want to see it that way. I knew something had to be done, so I called my wife's closest friend, Penny, to ask what she thought we should do. She recommended we take a trip separately and volunteered to go with my wife to Georgia. I loved this idea, even though I was nervous to split from my wife. I'd slept next to her every night for more than 13 years, but I thought maybe that was why it was time for us to have our adventures and miss each other a little. I proposed this idea to my wife, and she was all for it since we'd be back before summer camp was over. She started planning, packing, and texting on her phone. I was actually a little bummed that she didn't show any hesitation departing from me, but I knew she was a strong woman, so I didn't let it get to me. However, a week into her separate vacations, she started replying less to texts, and whenever she did reply, it was short. I was having a great time with my uncle, and I did manage to forget about my wife and have fun for a while, but I eventually felt like I had to message Penny to ask if my wife was behaving strangely. She was hesitant to tell me that my wife went out without her a few nights, and most recently, she hadn't slept at the hotel. I freaked out. My heart had been telling me something was up, but I didn't listen. I asked if she had any idea where my wife would be, and she didn't know. I remembered that my wife had signed into her Facebook Messenger on my phone once when her phone was broken. I was able to sign back in and look through her messages. I found one string with an old flame of hers who lived in Georgia and talked about how nice it would be if she ever came back to Georgia for a visit. They exchanged Snapchat IDs, and that was the end of the messages there. I looked up AP's name online and paid $2 to see a list of his most recent addresses. According to this, he lived 45 minutes away from my in-laws' nursing home. I drove 6 hours to the address and arrived at 1 a.m., finding my wife's car in the driveway. I couldn't believe I actually found her. I banged on the door until AP answered it with a gun in my face. I demanded my wife back, and his look went from angry to surprised. She came out in a robe, full of disbelief. She asked how I found her and started shaking and crying before I answered her. She pleaded with AP to lower the gun and told me we should just go home because this was a huge mistake. I looked at AP and asked him if he had sex with my wife. He said, yeah, called me a name, and asked what I was going to do about it. I told him he spoke like a coward behind a gun. In his anger, he raised it again, which made my wife start screaming and pleading. I backed up towards my car with my hands up, telling my wife she's not coming with me. She expressed her disbelief as I said she could stay with this jerk for all I cared. She wailed and asked me about the kids as I shut my door and yelled out the window that she should have thought about them before cheating on me. I drove all the way home in silence. I broke the news to the kids that Mommy wouldn't be living with us anymore because she married another man. They were confused and heartbroken, and whenever she video called them, it was extremely awkward and nothing like being there in person. She didn't try to visit for a year, and whenever she did, the damage to her relationship with the kids was painfully obvious. They didn't want to listen to her, they didn't want to hug her, and they argued about everything. She told them she went back to AP and continued living with him even after she found him cheating on her. She just started ranting about it on Facebook, talking about how it was the last time, and she was going to leave and never look back. That kept happening for 5 years until AP died unexpectedly. Now I don't know where she's living, but I assume she's somewhere in Georgia, surviving in poverty without knowing her teenage children. The decision of your wife to cheat on you and leave you for another person caused you and your children a lot of pain and disappointment. Your decision to protect yourself and your children was an important step. Now you need to focus on your well-being and supporting your children to cope with this difficult situation together. Story 3. I remember my wife and I had a good relationship. We got married when she was 38 and I was 34. She divorced from her husband after the unexpected loss of their teenage son. I had never been married, but I was there for her, providing her a listening ear, a shoulder to cry on, and advice when I had it. My younger brother passed away, so I was very familiar with loss and how all you can really do is keep carrying on in honor of the loved one. I know my wife found strength, hope, and courage by watching, listening, and talking to me. I saw her physically change from an overweight, withered flower to a fit and glowing woman. We were married for 10 years, together for 12. I know it sounds like a long time, but it seems incredibly short when I say it. I didn't think I'd ever put a final number of years on our marriage. I worked in construction, building houses, and after I received my inheritance from my father, I designed and built my own. When it was done, my boss was so impressed with my architectural skills that he promoted me to that position. It was an incredible pay increase. This all happened before I met and married my wife, electing to share my wealth and good fortune with her. I thought that if anyone deserved a happy ending, it was her. 3 years into our marriage, she started a health, wellness, and healing video blog that changed the lives of several people. They looked up to her as an example of what they could become after a very traumatic life event. My wife had all the trust and privacy a woman could ask for. I never worried about her going behind my back, and I never asked to check her phone or accounts. She was never on her phone around me, but I did notice that whenever I came into a room and saw her on her phone, she'd lock it and put it down right away. I figured she did this out of respect for me so I didn't feel ignored. She knew that I hated how people nowadays have their phone in their face at all times. With the phone down, she warmly smiled at me and either listened to me or started a conversation. One day, I was working in my office when I noticed I had 2 missed calls from the police department. Worried, I called them back, and an officer told me that my wife was under arrest. I asked what the heck happened, and all she could say was that my wife was being charged with criminal mischief and destruction of property. My mind was spinning. I asked if she had the right woman, and she said they were certain they caught her on the property of the person that called. I realized I needed to speak to my wife right away, but the only place they'd allow me to do that was in an interview room. Sitting face to face in a white room with cameras rolling, I backed my wife into a corner. She had to tell me the truth no matter how unbelievable it was. It looked like she was wearing a mask because I'd never seen her face so defeated and flat before. After a few minutes of awkward silence, she told me she got revenge on a woman who stole her ex-husband, Stan, from her. Right away, I asked why she felt like she needed to get revenge now, after so many years. She looked away and started rubbing her arms like she was cold. She said she didn't know, and she wouldn't tell me anything else. She actually requested to go back to her cell. I couldn't believe it. Everything was moving in slow motion as my wife was escorted back to her cell, and I wandered into the lobby of the police station, wondering what to do next. Before I could leave, a woman came rushing into the station, furious. When she spotted my wife, she started screaming insults and cursed words at her for what she did to her house. The police surrounded both of them and tried to calm them down to prevent things from escalating. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. After the woman, Bethany, calmed down, she took a seat on a bench, waiting for something. I took a seat a few feet away until I felt it was safe to tell her I was my wife's husband. She scoffed and said I married a little girl. I asked her if she could tell me what was going on because my wife refused to say. It turns out my wife was getting revenge now because she was still sleeping with her ex-husband, Stan. Since I was looking at her like she was crazy, Bethany explained that she was Stan's girlfriend for many years, comforting him over the loss of his son even before my wife and Stan got divorced. Without Bethany knowing, my wife started sleeping with Stan again 2 years prior. Missing their son made her reach out to him, and the rest is history. I was trying to hide the fact that I was falling apart. I had no idea my wife was still talking to her ex, let alone sleeping with him. I had been played like a fiddle. To keep myself from crying, I asked Bethany what my wife did to her house. She said she spray painted on the front of it and broke 3 windows. This made her start crying hard, expressing how embarrassed she was and how she felt like the laughingstock of the neighborhood. I apologized to her, but she only sobbed that neither of us knew our spouses were cheating on us any chance they got. She gave me an awkward hug, but I think we both needed it. So, after more than a decade together, I found out my wife is sleeping with her ex again, and I couldn't forget I was in a police station because of my wife's unexpected jealousy and rage. She had a bond set, but I didn't try to bail her out. She was sentenced to a very large fine, and she had to pay Bethany for the damages she caused. Everyone in town heard about what happened, and she instantly got shunned by the community. This story demonstrates the complexity of relationships and the impact of betrayal on the human psyche. It is important to remember the significance of open communication, trust, and self-respect in relationships. It is also important to seek support and assistance during difficult times.